So, I'm about to make an argument that the N64 had the best Star Wars video game lineup of any console. First off, we had Shadows of the Empire. It was the pinnacle of Star Wars gaming. Follow that up with the Rogue Squadron franchise. Then finally, to wrap it all up, we had this unsung hero, Star Wars Podracing. That's what it was called, right? Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. I loved this game. I even somehow ended up owning it twice.
Now the first thing to do was to source some pod racers for my game. This actually turned out to be really easy to do, because if there's one thing George is good at, that's, well,
merchandising.
And that kind of leads into the biggest question I get about this project. What scale is it in? And to that, I always answer,
Star Wars Micro Machines
scale. That means that every pod racer is in scale to itself, but not every other pod racer.
Size matters not.
There was, however, some modification to get them ready for the tabletop. First, the power energy binders were fluctuating pretty wildly, so they need some recalibration.
Keep away from those energy binders. If your hand gets caught in a beam, it's gonna go numb for hours.
Thanks for the warning. Now I'm detecting a spike from an overload in the thermal plasma generators. I noticed the repulsor lift engine had a clog in the fuel manifold, so we'll need to source a new power distribution array to replace the burnt out energy conversion matrix, and this allowed me to recalibrate the magnetic field generator and realign the gravitational polarity. However, Anakin's pod wasn't the only one to get an upgrade. I upgraded the energy conversion matrix of Sabolo's pod by installing a Geller field generator.
Reason, no only war.
It's working! It's working!
And then the pod racer was complete.
And that's where the liquid latex comes in. It's like a deflector shield that helps keep all the spray paint from sticking to the wrong parts of the model. And don't be shy with it. In this case, remember, more is, well, more. Once the masking medium is applied, it's time to skew these pod racers like they're a roasted Kowakian monkey lizard. Then it's time to take them outside, and after priming all the pod racers, my yard kind of looked like it was visited by Imperial stormtroopers.
Blast him!
But it was worth it. Next up is the silver dry brush. This is where we start hinting at the classic Star Wars grime that we all know and love. After that, it's time to get creative with each pod racer's unique paint scheme. We'll be layering on a base coat, a highlight, and some weathering to really bring them to life. Oh, and here's a pro tip. If you're struggling to get a color to cover, mix it with a white or another opaque color to create a solid base coat to build on. And while I tried to follow the official paint scheme of each racer, I didn't get too hung up on perfection. After all, the best part of painting our own hobbies is taking some creative liberties and making them their own.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Okay, so there's still a lot that has to be done, and I need to speed this up because, frankly, inspiration is starting to kind of waver. This project is blown up and it's taking way longer than I want, and I'm ready to be done and move on to other things. So I'm going to be cheating with the second level of pod racers. Basically what I'm doing is I'm going to tape these on here. I'm hitting it with this Vallejo matte primer, and hopefully that will work as a clear primer so I can just paint over the existing color.
Spoiler alert, it worked like a charm. Yippee! So don't be a nerd like me, and remember this trick for future painting.
Let's be smart about this and not redo work that's already been done.
After we're done painting, we need to tidy up the plastic. I just used some isopropyl alcohol and these cute little cotton toothpicks I found on Amazon. Once we're done with our alcohol bath, it's time to attach the pod racers to their new bases. I used these plastic square bases and either the plastic rod from the original Podracing toy, or just a trusty paperclip to attach them securely. Lastly, I covered the bases with some desert sand basing medium, and voila! We're done. Okay, so it's time for the next dilemma of this project. I really wanted to have this cool table that looked like the dunes of Tatooine that I could roll out whenever I needed to, spice up the boring old dining room table. So I decided to build a dirt-covered tablecloth, but I also need to store it away when it's not in use. First, I got myself a canvas drop cloth from one of the big box home improvement stores. Then I covered it with some cheap silicone and sand. After that, I drenched everything in a mixture of white glue and water and painted it with some latex house paint.
You're breaking my heart.
And now that the foundation of this table is laid, I can start to make some cool little features that our pod racers can zip around and in between. Starting with a takeout container that still had the lovely aroma of meals from yesteryears, I then added a second layer with an old yogurt cup, and finally topped off this trash tower with my lamp knob. Then I decided to add a bit of that Star Wars je ne sais quoi, and I slapped 4 toilet paper rolls onto the side. And with that, that's my first building done. Oh, and while you weren't looking, I made another one. I mean, please pay attention. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, that looks nothing like a building on the Dune Sea. And you'd be right. But if you want to see how I turned them from old refuse into rustic real estate, you're going to have to hang on, because this table is large, and we need to start filling up with some real honkers of terrain, or else we're going to be here, like, forever. Luckily, I got something else brewing.
Best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup.
And I do consume coffee faster than Boba Fett's descent from badass comedic relief. While this container has a cool shape, it needs a little more pizzazz. So I cut out the sides of the coffee container. I then chopped up this old shipping tube. Well, that went surprisingly well, so we're just going to go ahead and attach those to the side, and will you look at that, we made a spaceship.
What a piece of junk!
Well, I'm no smuggler hunk, but our stack of junk, it needs a good captain. So I'm going to use these crunchy cereal boxes to blend in the tubes on the side. So symmetry really isn't a thing in Star Wars. So let's add a balcony to our large building because we think it's a good aesthetic choice, not because we're getting lazy. I then used an old packaging from a smoke detector to make our trash tower's flat ceiling, just a little more appealing. But if this build is starting to get a little too complicated, don't worry, I'll give you a moment to catch up.
So uncivilized.
Oh look, another scrap scraper. Okay, so we have one more building to make for our racetrack, and that's the grandstands. This was probably the hardest building I had to make for this project, but that's just foreshadowing. So let's just start with the easy stuff. Unlike every other building, I actually paid for some of the building supplies here. Foam core, though, is quite affordable. So with some quick cutting, some eyeball measurements, I had this building roughed out in no time. And wow, another shape that looks nothing like what we see in the movies. Well, I guess it's time to change that.
Most impressive.
Now, the key ingredient to our secret cinema sauce is wall filler. I grabbed a big handful and slapped it on the building, smearing it all around and icing up our clutter cakes. We'll let that dry until tomorrow. Now that our dessert of detritus is dry, we can celebrate the number of videos this channel launched last year. So be sure to subscribe so I can flood your YouTube feed with tons of content. Now, we are working in Micro Machine scale, which is significantly smaller than the 28mm scale I'm used to working in. So I had to knock back some of this filler texture. And we just did that with some hand sanding. Then my weak arms gave out, and I used a Dremel tool to sand the rest.
Okay, so good news, bad news here. Bad news is I forgot that the bottom of this building is supposed to have like this little loop thing right here, and a loop is a very technical term. So if you can't follow that, what I mean is the bottom of the building is supposed to bulge out in the video, the movie Phantom Menace. Good news is because we have to like shrink this board down just for gameplay mechanics, that this is actually going to have the grandstand coming off the back of it and probably some rock texture. So I really only need to worry about the front part of the building. But I got an idea on how we're going to fix that, so let's see if we can get that done.
I decided to flare out the bottom of the taller buildings by bulking it up with some aluminum or aluminium foil. At this point, the buildings were looking a little blah, and I needed to add some extra detail. I also decided that oversized doors are kind of the thing on Tatooine. And I can make some out of some bread tabs and cereal box for my small buildings. I then took some plastic packaging from some purchases at the hobby store and made doors for the large buildings. Oh, and then I had to plug this large hole in the taller building. I just used a bit of stereo card for that. And just like General Mills, I would love to hear your comments and questions, so please leave them in the comments section below.
Do they have a Squarespace sponsorship?
I used some granny grading to cut out windows and glued them onto the side of the buildings. The next step was to merge the new additions into the existing structure, and to do this I used Vallejo acrylic medium to cover up the gaps. I also used some more acrylic medium and kind of sponged it on there to give it a slightly texture to the plaster that looked like it belonged with a smaller scale. Now that we have things for our pod racers to fly around, it's time to come up with things that they can fly into. I figured it was time to start building one of the most iconic landmarks of our twin sun planet, Beggar's Canyon. I started with some white foam from an old appliance delivery. This stuff is not great for detail work, but it's perfect for bulking up land masses, and you can't really complain about the price of free. So I put on a respirator and started carving it with a hot wire cutter. Since my hot wire cutter is kind of cheap, and it pretty much has two settings, either on and off. So I also set up a ventilation to remove some of the fumes from my work area. Remember, there are many ways to cut plastic and foam, but all of them are bad for your lungs. So take precautions and protect yourself. I then started to glue the foam to the back half of my arena. This terrain piece is going to sit in the middle of the table, so one side will be the grandstands, and the other side will be the rocky sands. Then to just shore up the foam, I drove in some wooden cocktail sticks. And then once the glue had fully set, I just trimmed everything off.
Stand by, I am control. Fire.
Now it's time to start making this foam look more like rock. I started by plucking at it with my hands, and this gives a nice start. But the real trick to easy, convincing rock texture, in my opinion, is these bits of cedar bark mulch. I picked up these 2 bags from my local home and garden store, and now I'm drowning in model rocks. I then filled the gaps with more gap filler and sprinkled some more sand
It's everywhere.
to give it a
Course.
texture. I also made some large rocks to put in the way and give Beggar's Canyon a more canyon feel. Then I covered them in paste, which I made from plaster, brown paint, and Mod Podge. This is an idea I got from this fish over here. I then made some smaller rocks. I did this the same way, except I used less foam and less plaster paste. The only difference, really, was I glued these small rocks to some adhesive floor laminate sheets. This gives you a nice flat base that doesn't warp. And I originally saw this idea over on my buddy's channel, Dice Chatter. So now it's time to get onto the painting. And for the most part, this is pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to show you the highlights. Now, for my small buildings, I went all out. I used several brown washes from Citadel, and I mean, yes, sure, this was a bit pricey, but I did save quite a bit on construction material, so I didn't mind splurging just a little. The next step was to paint the windows of each building. I just painted them black. I'm not sure if there's glass in there or whatever the Star Wars equivalent to glass is. Or, you know, maybe it's just an open air balcony. I originally thought I might drop like a little dollop of UV resin in each of the windows. But then I decided I don't hate myself. And I'm just not up for that level of torture. So, in my opinion, the secret to like good-looking terrain is to mix colors. I mean, really, besides like a freshly painted building, you're rarely going to see anything in the real world that is uniformed and all the same color. I mean, sun bleaches and grind gathers, and it kind of happens randomly. I mean, not quite, but for our purposes, it does. And I mean, we're not even going for a real world look because we're painting a rocket chariot racing arena. So let's just let Rule Cool be our guide. Now, while we're on topic of Rule Cool, I decided to take some creative liberties with these buildings and add this black weathering to the bottom. I think this is more like street grime, like exhaust and stuff like that. And maybe even the occasional pod racer kind of skipping off the side of these buildings. I really don't have a good reason to justify this, other than the board was just too brown and I thought it looked cool. For the metal bits, I went with a bronze color instead of silver, to add a touch of that classic Tatooine vibe, I guess. And that's basically the small buildings done. So let's move on to the larger buildings. I pretty much followed the same painting technique. The only real exception is that I'm not made of money, so I had to make my own homemade washes out of acrylic paint, water, and a small drop of dish soap. While I am painting here, you can kind of see what I'm doing, so I just want to take a quick moment to thank some of the folks for supporting the channel. First off, I have to give a big shout out to my incredibly patient Patreons, who, frankly, are really understanding of my infrequent upload schedule. They also are exceedingly kind on our Discord, so it's a pretty cool place to hang out. Also, I want to give a huge thank you to my friend Leif from Devs and Dice for his voice acting as Vader. And then my mate Nate from the Land Down Under. He runs the YouTube channel Nate's Miniatures, and he has given me so much advice on video editing and frankly watching all my dumb Star Wars skits like 1,000 times over. So thanks for that, Nate. And then I also need to give a shout out to Lila, the Mini Witch, for continuing to inspire me to bang my head against this frustrating wall we call YouTube. And finally, thank you for sticking with me this far into the video. As a token of my appreciation, I'm going to share with you now the hardest part of this project. And that was the audience grandstands. Well, I mean, not the grandstands, but the audience in the grandstands. Now, the original model makers in Phantom Menace used cotton swabs as the audience in the wide shots. But at this scale, that would make it look like a horde of Rancors were watching the pod race. I started by making some grandstands. I could glue on later. And these were made out of a sheet of styrene.
I don't know why, but this noise just cracks me up.
I then measured out the grandstands and figured out where they should be placed on the final building. I then cut up some zip ties to make the border of the stairs and the entrances of each grandstand. And then for some reason, I guess I decided to prime them gray. Probably not the most ideal choice, but it's what I had lying around, so oh well. For the audience, I decided to make a pact with the Dark Gods and brought these eternally cursed polystyrene beads into my home. So I mixed up these polystyrene beads with some colorful inks. Now that they're dry, it's time to mix them up into the most disappointing jar of sprinkles to date. Okay, let's cover these grandstands in glue. Sprinkle some love over the top. And some of the sprinkles ended up drying on the stairs. Which, I mean, was unplanned, but also kind of cool, because, I mean, how it just sort of looks like somebody's head off to drop a hut into the Sarlacc pit. Now it's time to add some final touches. I put some doors at the back of these arches that, frankly, you'll never see. I 3D printed some terrain by Darkfire Designs.
That was easy.
And then with just some other this and that, these buildings are quickly getting to the point of diminishing returns. So why don't we just jump on over to the final results? So you might be asking yourself, hey Dave, what rule set are you using with this? And frankly, I have no idea. I originally thought I was going to use Gaslands, but after reviewing the rules, I feel like it's a little too combat focused for what I'm trying to do with Podracing. So if you know any cool racing games, please list them off in the comments. I would love to hear your feedback. And really all I have left to say is...
This is Podracing.